Good afternoon. A warm welcome to all our viewers. Thank you for tuning into one of the European Union side events at COP28. This one is organized by us in the European Commission Director General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. My name is Ula Hudina, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. COP28 marks a truly crucial moment for global climate action. Climate change is the biggest challenge of our times. Europe is leading the way in a transition towards an economy that gives more to the planet than it takes away. And this is why at this COP28, the European Union will continue to push for substantially scaling up global climate ambition to keep the 1.5-degree objective within reach, in line with the Paris Agreement. Facts are facts, and this year, yet again, the climate change impacts have continued to increase. Global temperature records were broken again. And certainly in Europe, the summer of 2023 will be remembered as another turning point. Massive flooding hit Slovenia and Greece. Unprecedented wildfires raged in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and also in Greece, while severe droughts gripped the Western Mediterranean. 2023 has been the hottest year in 125,000 years, and the hottest temperature record has called for a political response. As regards people's opinion, a very recent Eurobarometer survey finds that a wide majority of Europeans agree that the green transition should not leave anyone behind and feels a personal responsibility to act upon it. And the majority of the Europeans also think that the transition to a green economy should be faster. And as regards what companies think, according to a recent SAFE survey pilot, stricter climate standards provide a stronger incentive for firms, especially larger firms, to invest in climate change mitigation. So what have we done so far in the European Union? With the European Green Deal launched in 2019, the European Commission has set out a vision for Europe to become the first CO2 emission neutral continent by 2050. And since 2020, the European Commission has been putting in place a sustainable finance framework to mobilize the needed public and private investments to reach the Green Deal's objectives. And the past years have been anything but easy. The past years have been actually incredibly challenging for Europe, but we still firmly believe that the European Green Deal is the answer to both our energy security and our climate challenges. And this is why the EU policymakers, investors, and corporates have been increasingly committed to drive the transition to a sustainable and net zero future. And in this context, earlier in this year, the European Commission has also proposed the Net Zero Industry Act. Mobilizing private investments and projects is therefore key to support the clean energy transition. And today's session will be focused precisely on this. We will hear 4 speakers: Merete Clausen from the European Commission, Alexandrina Bojanova from the European Investment Bank, Craig Douglas from World Fund, a venture capital fund specialized in climate technologies, and Gideon Schwitz from Silip, an innovative startup contributing to a net zero economy. And at the end, dear participants, online watchers, we will of course answer also questions from you, the audience. And for this, I invite you already now to use the Slido and post any queries or questions or comments you might have when listening to our speakers' presentations. And now, with any further ado, I would like first to invite the European Commission speaker, Merete Clausen, Director of the Investment Directorate at the Director General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs, to deliver the first presentation of today and introduce you how the European Commission flagship program, the InvestEU program, contributes to supporting the EU net zero industry. The virtual floor is now yours, Merete.
Hello, and thank you for watching this COP28 side event of the European Commission. Those of you who may have watched our COP27 side event of last year will already be familiar with our main EU spending program, the InvestEU program. And you will be familiar with how it promotes the EU's climate goals and how it contributes to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. But in the meantime, since last year, actually in March of this year, The Commission's proposal for a Net Zero Industry Act, our blueprint for promoting investment in increased production in the EU of products that are key in meeting the EU's climate neutrality goals. Since then, it has been adopted. So therefore, I will focus today on how InvestEU can contribute to the objectives of the Net Zero Industry Act. But first, for those of you who could not watch us last year, I will quickly sketch out the background and the framework for InvestEU's contribution to sustainability and to the climate agenda, both of which run through the program like a red thread. Now, the EU and all its member states have signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. This means we adhere to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and that our policies and programs must be designed to contribute to delivering on our Paris commitments. This is also the case for the EU strategy for removing obstacles to the free flow of capital in the internal market, also called the Capital Market Union. And so it happened that as part of the Capital Market Union Action Plan, the Commission set up a high-level expert group to develop a comprehensive European strategy on green finance. And one of the conclusions of this high-level group was that finance must contribute to a higher extent to sustainable and inclusive growth. And as Ulla mentioned, we since adopted an EU sustainable finance strategy that sets out how public and private investment can support and accelerate the green transition. And in the next slide, let's look a bit closer at the ambition that we have set out for the EU. The European Green Deal, which is basically our EU decarbonization strategy, states that the EU should become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. We also want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% compared to 1990. To reach these objectives requires a major overhaul of the EU economy and industry and considerable investments. Our estimations tell us that at least 480 billion euros and perhaps even as much as 700 billion euros per year is required, in addition to the previous investment levels, to decarbonize the EU economy as planned. This investment gap cannot be filled by the public sector alone. So we need to help the public and the private investment industry by developing the tools to finance sustainability. And this is what we're doing with the EU taxonomy, our classification system for economic activities that contribute to the net zero trajectory by 2050, and other tools as well. Next slide. As mentioned, new policy objectives have been adopted to support the ambitious EU climate targets. Last year, the Commission's Repower EU strategy was the Union's plan to save energy and diversify energy sources. And this year, in 2023, the Commission has adopted a Green Deal industrial plan. This is our plan to improve the competitiveness of Europe's net zero emission industry. Net zero technologies are key enablers for the decarbonization and for the green transition. And net zero technology developers need access to raw materials that are in short supply and for which the EU often depends largely on third countries. To address this, the Commission has proposed both a Net Zero Industry Act and a Critical Raw Material Act. We're going to look at the next slide, or rather the next slide again, please. A bit more into the Net Zero Industry Act. Our proposal is not a silver bullet, but to stay in the weapons arsenal analogy, it provides a set of arrows that target the decarbonization and the energy resilience objectives of our proposal. Overall, it shows that the EU is committed to play a leading role in the net zero technology transition. We want to secure access for our future energy systems to the technologies that will decarbonize them. It's the wind turbines, it's the electrolyzers, it's the batteries, the solar photovoltaic, it's the heat pumps, etc. Europe is currently a net importer of the net zero energy technologies. With the Net Zero Industry Acts, we want for these most important and the most strategic of these technologies, we want to reach a domestic manufacturing capacity of 40% of the EU's annual deployment needs by 2030. We also want to create a regulatory framework that simplifies and speeds up permitting. Across the EU, there will be clear and predictable time limits for the entire permit granting process. Much lower limits than the 2 to 7 years that we have seen in some member states and for some technologies. This should cover all relevant administrative authorizations from application to final approval of the project, and also the environmental authorizations, but without in any way reducing the importance of the environmental authorizations that need to be there, need to be given to the net zero industry projects. And we also want to create net zero academies for bridging the acute skills gap that we have for net zero technologies. And we want to create regulatory sandboxes to test innovative net zero technologies. So these are some of the main features of our Net Zero Industry Act. On our next slide, I will zoom in on the funding of the net zero technologies, because there are several union funding programs that are already available to support investments in net zero technology manufacturing projects. In addition to InvestEU, I can mention the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is our post-COVID recovery instrument for the EU member states. There are instruments under the cohesion policy, and there is also the Innovation Fund for Climate. But zooming in now on the InvestEU program, of course, it supports other goals than sustainability and climate action. But as I said earlier, the climate agenda is a horizontal objective, red thread through the program. So at least 30% of the investments that are supported must contribute to climate objectives across the 4 main windows that you see on the bottom of the slide. These windows represent high value added priorities for the Union. First of all, sustainable infrastructure, then research, innovation, and digitization projects. Of course, we must not forget our small and medium-sized businesses that are supported under the 3rd window of InvestEU. And finally, the 4th window supports social investment and skills. And the main pillar of InvestEU is the InvestEU fund. It uses guarantees from the EU budget to support the investments of other public and private investors. And in that way, it de-risks their investments and mobilizes much more investment. But of course, doling out finance is not enough, as we know. The EU money needs to be accompanied by other support to projects, by technical advice to make them bankable and financeable. And it also needs to be accompanied by matchmaking with interested investors. And this is what we have the InvestEU Advisory Hub and the InvestEU Investment Portal for. The next slide will show you how the de-risking I was speaking of works. So we have guarantees under InvestEU of up to 26.2 billion euros. These are given to banks and other financial institutions. This allows them to give loans, guarantees, and even equity finance to projects. And this risk-taking in turn allows private investors to have confidence in the projects and come in with their investments, altogether resulting in expected investments of up to 372 billion euros over 7 years. This is not enough to fill the gap, which, as we saw before, just for climate-related investment is even more than this amount on a yearly basis. But it is still a significant contribution, taking into account that the EU budget from which we take the EU guarantees is only about 1% of total member state GDP. And InvestEU will also help the implementation of the proposed Net Zero Industry Act. Once the act is adopted by the EU legislator, the InvestEU program will be targeted to even further boost investment and provide technical assistance to strategic net zero industry projects. The next and last slide from me shows how InvestEU is implemented. We have a number of partners that help us. There are banks, guarantee providers, venture capital funds, and the finance reaches them, or reaches rather the beneficiaries, through this implementation chain of partners. And today we have 3 panelists to illustrate how the InvestEU implementation model works to support investments in net zero industries in practice. First, the European Investment Bank, the EIB, as the main implementing partner of the InvestEU fund. And next, we have the World Fund, a climate tech venture capital fund that received an InvestEU-backed equity investment of 50 million euros from the European Investment Fund, or the EIF, who is part of the EIB group. And finally, we have Silib, a battery recycling company that has benefited from an investment from the World Fund, supported by the EIF and by our InvestEU guarantee. So let's now listen to their experience.
Thank you very much, Merete. Our next speaker is Alexandrina Boyanova, Head of Climate Office Operations at the European Investment Bank. As you have just heard from Merete's presentation, the European Investment Bank is one of the main implementing partners entrusted by the European Commission to provide financing projects under the InvestEU. And now Alexandrina will present you in more detail how the European Investment Bank has implemented such InvestEU financing products and thereby supported the transition towards a net zero industry. And now, Alexandrina, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ula, and thank you very much, Marete. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today with our partners from the European Commission and also from representatives from the private sector. I look forward to a very interesting exchange also with those of you who are online. Maybe we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just a quick overview of what I would like to cover during my presentation today. So to set the scene, I will start with a quick overview of who we are, who the European Investment Bank Group is, and what are our objectives as the EU Climate Bank. I will then zoom in on our support to the net zero industry transition in the context of the Repower EU and the Green Deal Industrial Plan, followed by a few examples of the types of projects we support under InvestEU. And I will then make a few concluding remarks and pass on the floor to my fellow panelists. Next slide, please. So to recall, the EIB group consists of the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund, our subsidiary, which provides risk finance to SMEs. We were established with the Treaty of Rome and are governed by the EU member states, who also set our priorities. What maybe few of you may know is that we are actually the world's largest multilateral lender, bigger than the World Bank and the EBRD. As the European Investment Bank, we are not only an investment bank, but also a global development bank. Indeed, our activities are primarily inside the European Union, around 90%, but we also have activities worldwide. EIB Global is our development arm, and it provides financing for the remaining 10% of our activities. We are headquartered in Luxembourg, but we have offices around the world. Next slide, please. So EIB is the EU Climate Bank. We have traditionally been amongst the largest providers of climate finance. We extended over 200 billion euros of climate finance in the last decade. And again, an interesting fact for those of you who may not necessarily know, we invented, for example, the green bond concept, and we were the world's first green bond issuer in 2007. What happened in 2009 is that we stepped up our climate ambition, and EIB made a number of important changes and policy commitments, transforming ourselves from the EU bank financing climate, if I may, into the EU Climate Bank, i.e. climate became a transversal objective for everything we do. So this included withdrawing our support for unabated fossil fuels, fully aligning our operations with the Paris Agreement, dedicating at least 50% to green financing, and committing to mobilize at least 1 trillion euro during the critical decade until 2030. The Climate Bank Roadmap, the document that you see on the left of this slide, is the document which operationalized these commitments. A very interesting read, publicly available. I invite you to read it. Next slide. So now I will zoom in on our support to the net zero industry transition. As Maretta mentioned, the European Green Deal has identified a huge investment gap of around 520 billion euro from 2021 to 2030, of which close to 400 per year are for the energy transition and the decarbonization of the economy. And an additional investment of close to 92 billion euro will be required from 2023 to 2030 to boost our capacity to manufacture net zero technology. The industrial sector is, of course, crucial for the transition towards a competitive digital and climate-friendly Europe. The Inflation Reduction Act has really pushed the need for a new industrial policy at a time where the European industry has already felt severe pressure due to the high energy prices. But again, as Maretta mentioned, we had the Green Deal, which is the EU decarbonization strategy. And with the Green Deal industrial plan for the net zero age, we are moving forward. As the European Investment Bank, we focus our support on two key objectives. First, fostering the clean energy transition, and second, speeding up the deployment of green technologies in all sectors. And in the next two slides, I will try to provide a brief overview of what the bank has done in these areas. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, in 2019, we made a very important policy decision to stop financing unabated fossil fuels, and we focused our support on the clean energy lending. Over the past decade, we extended loans of over 100 billion euros to the European Union's energy sector, and this included investments in energy efficiency, renewables, grids, and also storage. We were amongst the first financiers of offshore wind farms some 20 years ago, at the time when these investments were considered too risky by the market. We still remain one of the largest lenders in this sector, and also focus our support on new innovative solutions, like, for example, the floating wind farms. Grids have also been traditionally supported by the EIB, and also our energy efficiency lending volumes have gone up significantly in the last couple of years. In response to the energy crisis, and also to help end the dependence on Russian fossil fuels, in 2022, we further increased our support to the transition with an additional 50% package, and I will speak about the REPowerEU response of the EIB in one of the next slides. Next slide, please. Now about innovation. The green transition entails a dual and almost simultaneous challenge: innovation and scale. According to the International Energy Agency, around half of the technologies to get us to net zero have not yet been commercialized, although in the most recent communication, I read that this percentage has decreased to 35, which means that we are moving in the right direction and new technologies are being scaled up. We have a very long track record of financing innovative climate technologies, providing support across all their stages, from basic research and proof of concept through demonstration and scale up. And in the last few years, we've lent more than, again, 220 billion to innovation. We are moving on now from supporting offshore wind to pioneering of new technologies such as wind, floating wind, green hydrogen, and also energy storage solutions. Next slide, please. As the EU policy-driven bank, we align ourselves with the priorities set by the European Union, namely Repower EU and the Green Deal Industrial Plan. As mentioned just a few minutes ago, in October 2022, our board of directors approved an additional package of 45 billion euros to lend in three specific areas: sustainable energy, energy efficiency, and green innovation. And with these, we're expected to mobilize an additional 150 billion of investment. What is important and what we adopted in July this year is that following the adoption of the Green Deal Industrial Plan, we broadened the scope of eligible sectors to allow for the financing of EU clean tech manufacturing technologies and also critical raw materials. And the targeted sectors include solar, onshore and offshore wind, battery and storage, heat pumps, electrolyzers and fuel cells, and carbon capture and storage, as well as grids. Marete also mentioned the importance of skills. Through this package, the EIB will also support the reskilling and upskilling cost of our workforce to ensure that we have the proper means to deliver the required set of skills for the net zero transition. Next slide, please. On this slide, I hope you can see it clearly. I have tried to summarize the bank's financing toolkit, which ensures the funding for projects at the different risk levels. We support the entire spectrum of technological innovation, from seed capital for very early stage development through to senior debt for mature technologies. As we know, both are equally important for the transition. We need the large volumes to accelerate the deployment of mature technologies such as renewable energy and grids, but we also need the risk-bearing capacity and the risk appetite to support innovation. EIB's funding is particularly important now in times of crisis and high interest rates, as we pass on the benefit of our AAA rating to our borrowers, and we can also provide very long-term and flexible maturities up to 20 years, as you will hear later from the examples that I have prepared. Looking at the slide, though, I would like to focus your attention on the risk-sharing and blending part of our business, as it is a key enabler of the green transition. Together with the EC, we have developed a number of financial instruments to blend resources and de-risk investments. We have achieved very good results with FC, Connecting Europe Facility, InvestEU, but also the Innofin Energy Demonstration Project instrument, which is another risk-sharing mechanism to support first-of-a-kind demonstration projects at pre-commercial stage. The EIB is also a partner of the Innovation Fund, which provides technical and advisory support to early-stage, highly innovative projects, and I will speak about our advisory offer in one of the next slides. Next slide, please. As already mentioned by Marete and Ula, we are indeed the key implementing partner of the European Commission with 75% of the InvestEU guarantee. Also under InvestEU, we have up to 270 million of funding allocated to the InvestEU Advisory Hub for areas such as market development, capacity building, and project level advisory services. For me and for all of us, really, at the EIB, InvestEU is a key instrument that allows the EIB group to deploy new instruments and to take even more risk. As we know, this is particularly important to support the net zero transition. And as I mentioned, I have a few examples that, if we have time, I would like to illustrate how InvestEU has helped us with taking more risk and financing these highly innovative projects. Next slide, please. A few words about our advisory offer under InvestEU. Before the crisis, I think it became evident to everyone that despite the low interest rates and the availability of funding, as well as the really pretty decent risk appetite on the side of investors, we were still missing good and bankable projects, and more generally, companies lack the capacity to prepare and implement projects. So here is where our EIB advisory offer on the InvestEU comes in. As mentioned earlier, we have almost 300 million euros at our disposal, which we can deploy to fund project advisory, capacity building, and market development activities. Importantly, these are free of charge for public and private promoters alike. Next slide, please. And here a few examples of how we collaborate with the European Commission and the InvestEU. The areas I mentioned, project advisory, capacity building, and market development, are part of the 300 million euros that we can fund. Next slide, please. A few initiatives to highlight to your attention. In collaboration with the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, we are providing advisory support to hydrogen innovators. We have a relatively good pipeline of projects for possible appraisal, including for electrolyzers, manufacturing, hydrogen trucks, and others. PATH is another example where the bank provides free of charge advisory for the development of corporate decarbonization and resilience plans, as well as bank transition plans. And the Green Gateway was really a huge success. It's a comprehensive advisory program that we are deploying for our financial intermediaries. It includes an online green checker tool that everybody can access, which allows the banks, but also the final beneficiary, to identify green investments. We also offer, under the Green Gateway, tailor-made advice on topics such as TCFD reporting, ECB reporting requirements, and also EU taxonomy alignment. One other block which does not feature on the slide, but I think it's very important to mention, is the ADAPT program, which focuses on adaptation and resilience, which are equally high on our agenda. We have given much attention to mitigation, but of course, we have all seen, as Ulla mentioned, that the frequency and severity of the weather events has reminded us how important it is to integrate adaptation in all net zero investments. So maybe as a conclusion, next slide, please. I think we all agree that we need to join forces for the transition to net zero to succeed, as the investment gap is huge. We are in the midst of a clean industrial revolution, and we need innovative companies. I'm turning here to our panelists like Scilib to drive that transition. Public banks like the EIB have an important role to play in providing the necessary risk capital, but we can do that better thanks to the support from the European Commission through InvestEU, where both the EIB and the EIF are main implementing partners. But again, Marete reminded us that the challenge is too big for us to fund alone, and we do need the private sector investors like World Fund to fill that gap. And I look very much forward to our exchange in this panel. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was on time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandrina. You are very much on time, and I thank you for this. And of course, we will also zoom into your examples a bit later on. And now, allow me to introduce Craig Douglas, because today we have the opportunity to understand more practically how the InvestEU and Net Zero industry objectives are put in practice on the ground. And for this purpose, I'm really delighted to be joined by one of the speakers who is himself an experienced practitioner and an InvestEU-backed fund, which invests then in startups of so-called climate performance potential. So Craig Douglas is a founding partner at World Fund, a climate tech venture capital fund, which only invests in technologies, as I said, showcasing or showing significant emission savings potential. And World Fund is focusing on energy, food and agriculture, manufacturing, buildings, and transportation sector. And Craig has been investing in equity in climate tech companies over the past 12 years. So over to you, Craig, now.
Thanks very much. So as I think it's been highlighted, we have received a significant amount of capital via InvestEU, totaling 50 million from EIF, of which InvestEU is the biggest contribution off. So we as a climate fund are purely focused on the on the largest decarbonization potentials companies. And in this session, I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the opportunities, why climate and why this program is particularly important for the startups, and then very briefly touching on the World Fund before handing you over to one of our portfolio companies. So if we move on to the next slide, this is really just the funding gap example of what we need to stay within 1.5 degrees. Now, where we are today, about $1 trillion a year. Where we need to be is about 8 trillion. Of that 8 trillion, at least 1 trillion of which needs to be from Europe. And as you can see, we've got quite a long way to go in terms of how we're going to get there. So moving on to the next slide, where does venture sit in all of this? I think these are the comments made earlier. The large green bars are where the existing technology is required for decarbonization, and the dark blue is where new technologies are required, both in 2030 and 2050. These have been revised recently, so glad to see that existing technologies are gaining momentum. But what's important here is that venture capital, and particularly the type of early stage companies that are required both for scaling up existing technologies as well as new technological development. And this is why the InvestEU program is particularly important, because it can focus on both sides, both the early stage, which we are very good at today in Europe, but really in the scale-up phase, which is kind of the biggest bottleneck in the ecosystem today. So moving on to the next slide, you see why Europe is such a good place to do this. So onto the next slide, you can really see that we are very good in Europe at the R&D side of things. Nearly 1/3 of the world's patents in climate tech come from Europe. So, we're very good at the initial side of things. And moving on to the next slide, you can really see that we put in a huge amount of capital in R&D. So we're very good at the early stage. What we've been somewhat lacking is the ability to get those ventures to be fully commercial. So getting them through that initial commercialization phase into mass deployment. And this is why the InvestEU program is so important, because it's willing to take some of that technical risk, where they've done it in the offshore wind industry over the last 20 years, making that a very viable industry with a lot of European champions. The question is, how can we do that for the next set of companies? And that's really what we focus on as a fund. But to highlight this further, if we look at the venture funding in general, moving on to the next slide, you can see that a lot of the investments that have been made today have actually been in a relatively small amount of the global emissions. So 85% of the capital that goes into equity investments that go into startups actually only go into about 50% of global emissions. And that's because transportation historically has taken the largest share of this. Now, what the multiple programs at the European level are looking to focus on is not just transportation, which is where a lot of the equity funding has gone into, but far more into the energy system, into the built environment, but particularly into industry as well. Industry is responsible for 34% of global emissions, but has actually taken only a tiny, tiny proportion of the investment into new solutions, only 9%. And this is one of the reasons why World Fund exists, because moving on to the next slide, we focus on those companies that actually have the largest emissions reduction potential. So we look at entire technologies and entire technology groups rather than individual companies or individual subsectors. We look at how could this technology fundamentally change the world, right? That's what we call climate performance potential. If this technology was adopted at scale, how could it affect the global climate? We put that in the context of how it contributes to the environment and other social dimensions to make sure that we're not moving emissions from one where, but actually hurting people elsewhere. And then we balance that all within our own theory of change to make sure that this company is really creating real additionality compared to others in the industry, and we're not creating any lockups. So moving on to the next slide. So we as a fund, we are a 350 million climate tech venture fund, talking about public sector money leveraging private. We received 50 million via EIF, and what that's allowed us to build is a 350 million fund. So that gives you a nice ratio of leverage from public sector to private sector. And that's because we've been doing this for a long time. No, we've, as a fund, we have a long history of all of the general partners of investing very successfully in the climate tech space. As mentioned before, I've personally been doing this for 12 years very successfully, backing some of Europe's largest climate tech winners in the past. So not only do we think that this is a great opportunity to decarbonize the planet, we also think it's a great opportunity to actually create a lot of wealth during that decarbonization. And the more of that we can keep within the European ecosystem, the better, which is why we have so many investors, and the majority of our investors are from the European ecosystem, whether that's the the European Investment Fund, or Hannover Re, KfW, NRW Bank, Ignitis Group, and many, many others, but the majority from the European ecosystem. So finally, moving on to the last slide, really, it was mentioned before, so we focus on the largest climate reduction opportunities. That really aligns very well within the InvestEU program. We typically take the early stage, so we start early, but really can put in a lot of capital to follow on our investments to the tune of 20 or 30 million. And then we look particularly at European technologies. We are a European fund. We really want to see European technologies flourish in a global context. And we invest across all the major CO2 emitting sectors. So food, agriculture, and land use on one side, but really on the energy, transportation, built environment, and industry. So perfectly aligned with the majority of the InvestEU goals. And with that, I'll finish off, and very glad to hand over to one of our most promising investments, Scilib, and I'll very glad that Gideon is able to join us today.
Thank you very much, Craig. It's indeed impressive, the leverage figures that you were mentioning to use. This is really showcasing your years of experience in investing. And without further ado, indeed, now it's time for your portfolio company, Scilib. And Dr. Gideon Switch is co-founder and chief operating officer of the startup Scilib, located in Germany, which offers a holistic lithium-ion battery recycling solution, basically an efficient, resource and climate-friendly recovery of all relevant battery raw materials. And Scilib's battery recycling plant has recently started operating. And before Scilib, Gideon obtained his PhD in engineering at the University of Aachen. The floor is now yours, Gideon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And thanks also that World Fund backs us, because it's very important. When you have a look at the slides, I think they will pop up. Yes, there. And when you look at the first slide, you see that there is a massive amount of batteries coming to the EU. And not only to the EU, also globally. The increase for batteries will be dramatically within the next few years. And with that, also the demand for all the materials in a battery will rise a lot. You look at lithium, you look at graphite, you look at nickel, you look at cobalt. All these commodities that are in a battery will be needed in the future. And how can we lever that we as Europe do not have these commodities here in Europe? Can you see on the next slide? Because when you look at where commodities come from, you see that lithium is important into the European Union, that graphite is important into the European Union, as well as nickel and cobalt. So we do not have these commodities here, but we urgently need them when we want to electrify our transportation, our energy storage, and everything that we do. And to do so, we can lever the large amount of batteries that go end of life within the next few years. As you can see on the left side of the slide, you can see that we will have a 20-fold increase of batteries that going end of life within the next few years. So what we urgently need is battery recycling within the next 3 years. And on the next slide, you can see that the European Union recognizes that. That is very lucky for all of us. In the future, battery recyclers have to recover certain amounts of a battery. And these minimum recycling efficiencies will be increased within the next few years. So processes that are established in industry right now will not be sufficient in the future. And to make that problem even more pressing, China just recently banned some types of graphite to be exported. So we as the European Union need battery recycling. Furthermore, we see that in the current state of the art, graphite and lithium are not recovered in the European Union in battery recycling. And when you look at the process chain in battery recycling, only parts of the process are conducted in Europe. So you have some black mass production, which is like kind of an intermediate product. You have some refining steps, like the refining from black mass to a final product, but you do not have holistic recycling opportunities in Europe, and we need them so dramatically. And therefore, what you can see on the next slide, we need a holistic battery recycling in Europe. That means we have to go from end-of-life batteries, you can see it on the right side, up to products that you can sell and that you can reintroduce into new batteries. And you have to have these processes in one hand, because that only increases your quality, it is easier for the market, it increases your output, and also when you have the whole process in a hand, you are able to leverage the energy that you need in recycling, because in such a process chain you can use off heat and off gas from first process steps, for example, also in the last process steps. And to look at such a process chain, what we developed in research within the past few years, you can see on the next slide, because the silent process goes from end-of-life batteries up to marketable products. For example, aluminum, copper, iron, but most important, lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. And when you look at the process chain, you can see that there are like different disciplines from engineering are used in the process chain. You have discharging and disassembly, which is like more kind of the electrical side of engineering. Then you have in the middle of the process chain, mechanical and thermal treatment process steps. We're talking about very low temperatures here, like a furnace at home. And therefore you need like strong metallurgical capacities in your company. And then you see the OLIC, which is like our optimized lithium and graphite recovery, as well as the hydrometallurgy, which means you have like chemical processes at the end of the process chain. And to build up such a complex process chain, which is needed to recover products holistically, you need a very strong team. And we built such a strong team, as you can see on the next slide. We were able to gather different experts from university, but also from industry. And with that strong team of persons, we built up a pilot line in Aachen, Germany, and are right now in the middle of industrializing our process. You can see there approximately 20 persons on the slide. In reality, we are already above more than 40 persons. So these are like the head of the respective teams. But we did not only build such a strong team, we also built up the tech in general. And for that, funding is crucial. On the next slide, you can see that we approximately raised 11.6 million euros so far, and also we're supported with several grants. So that helped us to fill an empty facility, as you see in January 2023 on the right side, up to a facility with the whole team and a strong technology to recycle batteries holistically. Also on the market side, large European automotive OEMs recognize that there is a need for battery recycling. They recognize that there is a need to strengthen their own supply chains. And therefore, our facility, as you see on the next slide, runs right now with approximately 0.5 ton of batteries per day. And you can see the beauty of that with thermal operations, mechanical operations, and chemical operations to recover the elements that we urgently need here in Europe to change our industry, to change our transportation to electrified processes. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Gideon. It's really impressive in 10 months, not just that you have really now a plan that it's functioning, but you also managed to have in one team so many experts from university to really the industry and all the investors backing you. So chapeau, well done. And now in the remaining time that we will have, we will of course try to answer the questions already received, and we will definitely combine those questions on slide and some other questions received as side questions. And allow me first to go back to my colleague from European Commission, Merete, on InvestEU program as such, on all the funding that we were just now presenting. Basically, the InvestEU offers also the advisory, and it was briefly mentioned by dear colleague from the EIB, but I guess Merete might want to add something as tips and advice for the investors and also for the companies hearing us now. Over to you, Merete.
Yes, thank you. One thing that I really want to make a bit of publicity for is what Alexandra was mentioning, that the EIB group, the EIB and the EIF have set up, meaning the Green Checker and also the Green Gateway, because these are online tools, practical tools that help, first and foremost, the financial intermediaries. It can be banks that are providing loans to SMEs that are active in the net zero industry technology sector, or it could be also funds, investment funds, funds managers that are active in those green technologies, and this helps. The tools that the online tools that the EIB and the EIF have on their websites helps the financial institutions to assess the green eligibility of projects for instance, EIB financing, EIF financing, or InvestEU financing. And the same for the tools that are targeting fund managers. These help the fund managers recognize potential transactions in the area of climate action and environmental sustainability. So this type of tools make it easy. It means that you don't have to start from scratch, but you can already, by making use of these tools, get an idea of whether your project would be eligible for funding from the EU, but also help you in areas such as reporting to figure out what sort of reporting is necessary for demonstrating that the money has gone to the right purposes.
Thank you very much, Merete. I would like now to turn first to Alexandrina, because you promised us a couple more of details on the projects already backed. So if you can go back now to these projects, really to illustrate how it happens in practice. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ula. And just before I move to that, I just wanted to say that I fully agree, first of all, with Craig about what he said, the need to scale up, that we are risking of losing these companies if we don't provide the necessary scale up finance. We might lose them to the US, for example. So indeed, InvestEU, a number of other mandates provide for that opportunity, and there is so much to be done there. Also, I was very happy to see, it's lovely really to see how a project comes to life from scratch. We heard you loud and clear, Gideon, with your message, and the example that I'm going to give actually nicely tie in with what you concluded about the need to do so much more in the battery industry. And finally, just Merete, what you complimented on the Green Checker, I wanted to provide reassurance to our online participants that the Green Gateway and the Green Checker more generally were indeed very successful as an online platform, and we would be looking to expand the tool to include other areas, for example, adaptation. So back to the examples, the three examples that I have. I don't know if we can put the slide on screen. Otherwise, you can find the links to these examples on our website. So the first one is Forestia. So this is an unsecured corporate risk loan to an automobile corporate supplier for innovative technologies in the fields of hydrogen and fuel cells, which requires an important amount of capex. And thanks to the InvestEU, EIB could provide the loan at very favorable terms, including a bullet repayment structure, which would not have been possible under our standard rules, given the risks that the project presented. Then the PCAM commercial demo plant, it's another type of instrument. So we are moving from the classical corporate debt to the venture debt. It's a 10-year venture debt for the construction and operation of a first of its kind commercial demonstration plant for the manufacturing of certain materials which are used in the production of advanced lithium-ion cells. Due to the really unproven nature of the technology at commercial stage and therefore the absence of track record, it is challenging for companies with a limited balance sheet to access commercial debt. And here again, with the help of the InvestEU guarantee and the thematic window, we were one of the few investors on the market that had the capacity via the quasi-equity operation to support this company in its effort to demonstrate the technical and commercial viability of their project. And finally, the Douai EV battery gigafactory, yet another instrument, a project finance loan for the construction and operation of an advanced manufacturing plant in Douai, in France, to supply Renault, en l'occurrence, with a new generation of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. The construction of the project is in line with our objective, as underlined by Marete and also by Gideon, to EU objective for clean mobility, to increase our made in EU battery production capacity. And of course, through this investment, we evidence our support for the net zero transition and how we strengthen our EU industrial sovereignty. This proposed non-recourse structure is innovative for this type of project because traditionally these projects are financed through corporate loans by commercial banks at the sponsor level. The increased risk profile of the loan, primarily it's a mixture of different risks, exposure to market technology or off-taker risk, went beyond what we would have traditionally regarded as acceptable for project finance operation. And again, thanks to the InvestEU guarantee, we could do this important transaction. So these three projects, I hope, illustrate the type of support that we can provide to companies at different stages of their development, and also a mixture of the different instruments that the EIB group has at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandrina. You really showcase how the European Investment Bank, as the Europe's climate bank, is now playing such a significant role in this net zero financing and actually showing the value of the limited funds that we have with the EU guarantee that you can indeed leverage there on the market. As we have both Craig and Gideon here, a quick question to both of you. What are then the remaining challenges or actually opportunities or your advice that you would like to give to our participants?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. There is more funding available than you would expect, but sometimes it can be difficult to access or figure out which ones you're applicable to. But use the tools that have been highlighted, because I think that really can help. So use the tools that are available. There is more capital out there than you realize. So go after as much as you possibly can, as long as it's in line with why you want the money in the first place to get you scale.
Thank you,
Gideon,
Craig,
you probably have
example.
practical experience.
Yes, I think that is like a very good one, because be curious in talks with investors, but especially regarding your tech, and try to understand your needs for scaling. Try not to scale too fast, try not to scale too slow. Do it for the customer, do it for the market, do it for society, and not for the sake of your project. Do it so that it is meaningful, that it makes sense. And with that curiosity and combination with strong investors, I think there are very high chances that you can be successful.
Thank you very much. This is really a recipe for success that you're sharing with us so openly. Thank you. I will turn now to the one important question we got through Slido, and I'll pass the floor to Merete. Namely, the question was about the EU funding that exists, or EU programs for supporting technologies linked to ecological water-saving solutions. Merete, if you can give us a few pieces of advice in a minute, basically. Thank you.
Certainly. It's a good practical example. And I think the answer relies a bit in what is it that you need for your project? Which stage are you in your project? What we have talked about today when we talk about InvestEU is about loans, about equity, about repayable finance, basically. But if your project is in an earlier stage, and you need rather grant financing, then InvestEU is not your program. Then we have, for instance, the LIFE program, which is the EU's funding instrument for the environmental and climate projects that need subsidies, need grant funding. And there is an EU executive agency called CINEA. It's the Climate and Infrastructure Executive Agency of the EU, and they are the ones that are implementing the grants for this type of projects. And I know that they have info days. Often they travel to the member states, so possibly they will have an info day in your member states in the next months, and that could be a good way to gather information. But again, there are other programs for other stages. If you need the research support, then Horizon is the program that provides grants for that. If you need a demonstration of a low carbon technology, then the Innovation Fund for Climate that I mentioned before would be the program for that. But all depends on what is the stage of your project. And please take contacts to our partners, take contacts to our executive agencies to give you the tailor-made and the exact information that suits your project.
Thank you very much, Merete. This was really an example how the EU is there from earlier stages to the later stages. And this now marks the end of our online session, site event at this COP28. We hope, all of us together, that it has been both interesting and informative for you online participants. I would warmly like to thank again our excellent speakers, and for you online participants, please feel free to contact our speakers individually if there is anything you would like still to follow up from today's discussion. And of course, if you're interested to watch this session again, you'll be able to do so via the event link once the session has concluded. So without further ado, this is the end. Thank you very much for watching us, and have a lovely evening in Dubai and also in Brussels or wherever you are now, in Germany, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.